Bedtime Reading. Moll Flanders, Chapter 1. This story took place in England in the mid-1600s, although the book was written in the early 1700s. The main character, Moll Flanders, was born with no fortune or any parents to care for her, but throughout her life she had attempted to find a wealthy husband and a fortune for herself. She was determined to find wealth and live a comfortable life, but found many troubles all throughout.
My true name is well known at the Newgate prison, although for many years I have used the name Moll Flanders. Most who know me well know me by the name Moll Flanders. Very few people in this world know of my true name. I have heard that in other nations, such as France, if a woman has a child while in prison, the government takes the child to a safe location where it is cared for and given clothing, meals, and schooling. When these children are grown, they are able to find honest work for themselves. Unfortunately for me, England does not care for prisoners' children as other nations do. My mother had been in prison for 7 months before I was born. She would have been killed for her crime, but because she was to have a child, the government did not demand that she die. My mother was sent to prison for stealing a few pieces of cloth. Quite an unimportant crime. When I was nearly 6 months old, the English government sent my mother to work in America. I was sent to live with various people who cared little for me. Eventually, I came to Colchester, in southeastern England. I was sent to the church, although the people there did not help me, and I was still too young to work, nearly 3 years old. Finally, the leaders in the town pitied me, a young child with nothing. They took me to a woman who owned a little school where she taught children to read and to work. I stayed in that place with that kind woman until I was 8 years old, when the leaders of the town declared that I should leave to find work. I was terrified to leave that sweet woman and her school, and cried quite often about having to leave. I asked the woman many times if I could stay, promising to work very well for her if she would allow me to stay. She finally agreed that I could live with her until I was older. I was still upset, however, knowing that I would eventually have to leave. She realized that I was still worried, which annoyed her. "I told you that you will not go to work until you are bigger. Why are you still anxious?" she asked me, looking quite angry. "Because I will have to finally leave." "What? Of course you'll have to leave eventually. Do you want to be a gentlewoman?" "Yes," I replied, and began to cry. This amused her, as I did not realize what being a gentlewoman was. I understood that a gentlewoman was simply a woman who worked for herself and made enough money to take care of herself, needing no money from others. However, I later discovered that a gentlewoman is a woman of fortune and comfort. This dear woman thought I wanted to become a woman of fortune, not simply a young, hard-working lady. After this, she went to the mayor, the main leader of the town, to explain my story to him. He found the story to be quite amusing as well, and told his wife and 2 daughters my ideas on work. They were quite curious about me and decided to come to the school to meet me. Soon enough, the mayor's wife and her 2 daughters came to the school and asked to see the gentlewoman, as they called me. They were quite amused and decided that I would soon become a gentlewoman indeed. They came to visit quite often, and usually gave me a shilling or 2 before leaving. Of course, I gave all the money I received to my dear nurse, the woman in charge of the school. My dear nurse, however, was so honest that she would never spend the money on herself, but would use the money to buy me clothing or new gloves. She would always show what she bought to the young ladies who came to visit me, always calling me the gentlewoman. The young ladies would then give me more money to buy more lovely things for the gentlewoman. The ladies would often bring their friends to come visit me, as I was quite well known in the town now. Many of the ladies gave me clothes as well as money. Finally, one of the ladies grew to love me so well that she invited me to live with her family for a short time, to be with her daughters. Her daughters and I became dear friends, and we grew to love each other as sisters. Soon enough, however, I returned to the school to be with my dear nurse for another year. I was now nearly 14 years old, and was quite useful to my old nurse. Although I did miss the comfort and fortune of the lady's home, living the rich life with her daughters for a short time, I wished to live there again. Soon enough, my dear nurse became ill and died. The school was immediately closed, and I was to be sent to work. I was frightened, as I no longer had a home or any one to care for me. The kind lady and her daughters came to the school after they heard of my nurse's death. They asked that I go to live with them again. I, of course, agreed, and continued to live happily with that family till I was 17 or 18 years old. I received the education of a true gentlewoman, as the daughters of the family had tutors to teach them French, dancing, and music. The girls were happy to teach me all they learned from their tutors. I learned quickly, and soon realized I had more talent than the ladies' daughters. Many had told me, as well, that I was much more beautiful than the girls were. However, my beauty soon became quite troublesome to me. This kind family had 2 sons as well. The elder brother was quite lively and handsome. He often told me of my incredible beauty, and proclaimed this as well to his sisters.
"Oh, Miss Betty,"
he would say to me,
"you must be the most beautiful young woman in Colchester."
"Oh, brother," his sister once said, "you must remember that if a young woman has beauty, manners, and talents, but has no money, she's nobody. Nothing but money will allow her to marry a gentleman." Her younger brother soon interrupted.
"Stop speaking, sister. I am an exception. I care little for a woman's money. Besides, beauty will sometimes take a man's heart before money."
I decided I must then leave the room. I felt quite uneasy listening to their conversation. I soon realized that as the brothers often spoke of my beauty and talents, the sisters envied me greatly. I never suspected what the sisters did, that the younger brother was, indeed, in love with me. The elder brother, rather distant and silent, had joked with me about being in love with me, but I never thought about what he intended to do with me.
Chapter 2.
One day the elder brother came running up the stairs to see me while his sisters were in the garden. He came into the room quickly, looking quite anxious.
"Oh, Miss Betty,"
he said.
"I want to speak with you."
Then he pulled me close to him and kissed me several times. I tried to escape, but he held me in his arms, continuing to kiss me. Then he sat down with me and said,
"Dear Betty, I am in love with you."
I was delighted to hear such words, but I did not know what to reply, and so I was silent. His sisters soon returned from the garden, and he quickly left the room. I was quite pleased to hear such things from a gentleman, and soon decided that I was in love with the elder brother as well. Unfortunately, I was honestly in love with him, but he was not truly in love with me, which I later discovered. The next time his sisters were out, he came to find me again, and sat down on his sister's bed next to me. He told me again of how he loved me dearly, but could not marry me until he received his fortune, which he would not receive until his father died, as I had no money of my own. He planned to make me happy, though, until that time. I was a poor fool then, however, as I believed that he would, indeed, marry me after he received his fortune, but he had no such plans. After we had spoken for a short time, he threw me down on the bed and began to remove my clothes. I was no longer an innocent young gentlewoman after that day. As he left the room, he kissed my cheek and placed 5 guineas in my hand. I was confused as to the reason for giving me the money, but was pleased with my new love. After that time, the elder brother often found me when his sisters were out, and would make love to me, and each time he left, he would place 4 or 5 guineas in my hand. I was amazed at my new fortune, and was too foolish to realize that it was to ruin me. No one else in the family knew of our love affair. The elder brother and I spoke little to each other when others were present. One afternoon he found me alone, and quickly came into the room and closed the door. He began speaking quite seriously. He promised that he would never cheat me, and swore that he would marry me when he received his fortune. He declared that he would never leave me, as he was deeply in love with me. He then gave me a purse with 100 guineas inside, explaining that he would give me 100 guineas every year until we were to be married. I worried that I might have a child, and he promised me that if I were to have a child, he would take care of me until we were married. We continued this way for half a year, although I was never with child. One day, nearly half a year after beginning the love affair with the elder brother, the younger brother found me in the garden and asked to speak with me. He declared that he sincerely loved me and wanted to marry me. I was confused and anxious. I refused the offer of marriage many times after, as he often came to speak to me about his love for me. He admitted that his mother and father would be disappointed that he was willing to marry a woman with no fortune, but he was not concerned with that. He was in love with me, although I felt nothing for him, as I was truly in love with his elder brother, who I planned to marry. His mother and sisters noticed that he was, indeed, in love with me, and became quite upset that he was interested in a woman with no fortune. Their behavior changed, and they became quite cold to me. I was not surprised at their changed behavior. I expected that I would soon be with child, and would have to leave the house, but that never happened. The younger brother often spoke of his love for me to his mother and his sisters. They became increasingly upset with his new love for me. I was quite worried about what to tell the younger brother. I decided that I must speak with my lover about the matter. The next time we were alone together, my lover noticed that I had been crying. I explained to my dear lover that his mother and sisters now acted quite differently in my presence. I cannot explain why they have changed their opinion of me, who they formerly considered as one of their own children. The elder brother smiled, then spoke.
They know nothing of our affair, but they believe my brother, Robin, makes love to you. He speaks of you often, declaring that he loves you and will soon marry you.
I began to cry, afraid to tell him of his brother's behavior toward me. Soon after, however, the elder brother asked me again to tell him why I was crying. I then told him of his brother's conversations with me. My lover was quite surprised at this news. After a short silence, he told me that I should not accept his younger brother's offer of marriage at the present, but that I should not refuse him immediately. I was quite shocked at his words. I reminded him that I could not accept the offer, as I was nearly married to his elder brother.
Well, my dear,
he said,
don't worry about that now. If I am not your husband, I'll be as good as a husband to you. I'll soon speak to my brother about this matter, then we'll discuss this again.
The next time we spoke, the elder brother informed me that he had spoken to his brother.
Well, Robin, do you honestly love the girl?
The elder asked his younger brother.
I do love her more than any other woman in the world. I will marry that girl, and I believe she will not refuse my offer of marriage.
I was shocked to hear this news. I could not refuse his offer without being forced to leave the house immediately. The family would be quite surprised as to my reasons for not agreeing to the marriage. I can refuse your brother, I told my lover. I cannot accept, as I am to be your wife some day.
My dear,
he said, looking anxious.
I will not receive my fortune for perhaps many years, as my father may live for a long time. I have been thinking about this matter for quite some time, and it upsets me as it does you. Perhaps you should think of marrying my younger brother. He loves you and will take care of you. You will live a comfortable life as a gentlewoman.
I was terrified to hear his words. He was quite calm as he spoke, attempting to persuade me to leave him to be with his own brother. This is impossible. I cannot simply fall in love with your brother. I have regarded you as my husband, and now you ask me to forget you, to be with your brother, because it is convenient. I would rather be your lover than your brother's wife. He was pleased to hear me declare this, but insisted that I must consider marrying his brother. He explained that if I refused his brother and continued with him, we would both be ruined. But if I were to marry his brother, I could find happiness and comfort in life. We only had a little time to speak, as his mother and sisters soon returned to the house. The next week we did not have an opportunity to speak, although he noticed that I was quite upset and confused with this terrible situation. The next Sunday, however, we were again alone together in the house. He came to see me, and we argued again about his brother's offer of marriage. We were together for an hour and a half, after which he told me calmly that we could no longer be lovers, as I may soon be his sister. I was hurt and lost, as I was deeply in love with the elder brother. I soon became quite ill, disturbed over the loss of my lover. I was kept in bed for nearly 5 weeks with a terrible fever. The doctors were confused and concluded that I must be in love. With this news, the family continually asked me whether I was in love or not, and with whom, but I denied being in love. One evening, while the family was having dinner, young Robin declared that my beauty and talents were far more than those of his sisters. His sisters became quite angry and demanded that I leave the house immediately. I was, however, still ill, lying in bed, as I had been for 5 weeks. "I believe," said one of the sisters, "that if Betty is not in love, then my brother, Robin, certainly is." Robin then declared that he was, indeed, in love with Miss Betty, and would soon ask her to marry him. Soon enough, the mother of the house came to speak with me about this matter. She asked that I answer her honestly about any affairs with her younger son, Robin. I told her sincerely that there had never been any affair between Robin and I. I told her that Mr. Robin had often joked with me, exclaiming that he was in love with me and wished to marry me, but I had never agreed. The old lady was satisfied with my answer, and kissed me before returning to the family. She went downstairs to find her children still quite angry with each other, as young Robin had declared that Miss Betty was more talented and beautiful than his sisters. Their mother came downstairs as they were quarreling. She told them that she had spoken to me, and explained to them that I had told her there was nothing between Mr. Robin and I.
"Miss Betty's wrong,"
replied Robin.
"I spoke to her many times about my love for her, but she never believed that I was speaking honestly."
"Well, Robin," said his mother, "no one ever knows when you are speaking honestly, so please do tell us now. Are you truly in love with Miss Betty?"
"Certainly,"
said Robin confidently.
"If Betty said she loved me, I would marry her tomorrow."
"But Robin," his mother said, looking anxious, "she has no fortune. How could you marry such a woman?"
"Unfortunately, she would never agree to my offer of marriage. I have asked her many times, but she has refused me every time."
"Well, Miss Betty is no fool, and has no money, so that cannot be true. If a wealthy man were to offer her marriage, of course she would accept, having nothing herself," interrupted his sister.
"Betty's no fool, but she has refused me, although I do not know why,"
said Robin. "Who must it be, then? Who is Miss Betty in love with? She never leaves the house," said the other sister.
"You have asked me many questions already, so do not bother me with any more. Ask my brother, perhaps he knows,"
said Robin, quite annoyed with his sisters. The elder brother was shocked to hear this, and believed that his younger brother must have discovered the secret between he and Miss Betty. He was so upset that he immediately came to tell me of the news, thinking that I had, perhaps, told Robin of my love affair with his brother. I told him that I knew nothing of it. I told him that while I was ill, I had many times hoped that I would die, rather than recover. I informed him that after I recovered, I would leave the family, declaring that I would never agree to marry his brother. His sister then entered the room, and our conversation was over. A few weeks after this, I recovered and was quite well, although in complete sadness, which surprised the entire family, except the elder brother. Every day I expected that the family would ask me to leave, as the mother and daughters believed that, but they said nothing. We continued this way for another 16 or 17 weeks. One evening the old lady said, "Betty, I am afraid that what I said to you about my son has greatly upset you, and that you are upset because you are in love with him. Robin often proclaims his love for you and declares that he will soon marry you if you will accept his offer. I did not wish him to ask me to marry him, although he has asked me many times. I have always refused. I respect you and your husband too much to agree to such a marriage, as I have no fortune, and would, therefore, ruin him if we were to marry." "Is this possible, Miss Betty? If you are speaking the truth, then we have not been fair to you." "You must ask your son. He will explain that I do speak the truth."
Chapter 3.
She then left to tell her daughters of our conversation. They were quite surprised at hearing the news. The old lady called her youngest son to come speak with them, asking him about what I had told her. He explained to her that I spoke the truth.
"Miss Betty still refuses to marry me,"
he told them.
"I have asked her 5 times since she recovered from her illness, but she refused me every time."
"I hope you are not speaking the truth," said his mother, looking quite confused.
"I am, indeed, speaking the truth. She has refused me because she knows you would not agree to our marriage. Although I am satisfied with her, I care little that she has no fortune."
His answer was surprising to them all. The mother and daughters felt terrible for their rude behavior towards me, and regretted thinking that I had a love affair with their youngest brother.
"I shall not marry my dear Betty unless you agree to the marriage,"
Robin told his mother.
"but I hope you will agree, as I will never marry another woman."
I was quite upset to hear this news, as I feared the old woman would soon agree to the marriage, and I would be forced to marry a man I did not love, but had been his brother's lover and was still in love with him. Their mother asked the elder brother his opinion, and he argued that she must allow his brother to marry me. The father was too concerned with his business affairs to worry about family matters. Therefore, the decision was entirely given to the mother, who eventually agreed to allow Robin to marry me. The elder brother then came to me to speak of the matter, insisting that I must not refuse his brother again.
"And now,"
he told me,
"you will be married to a gentleman of a good family with a good fortune to take care of you. If you do not agree to the marriage, however, you will live in poverty, known to have had lovers. No other man will consider marrying you. I shall always be your secret friend, but I will, as well, always be suspected as your lover, and so we will never meet."
He paused, but quickly continued.
"Our past love affair will always remain a secret. I beg you to consider marrying my brother. You will be safe and comfortable."
And he added,
"I here offer you £500 for the trouble I have caused you, which I hope you will forgive me for."
He then told me that if I refused his brother, he could not continue to be my lover. He still loved me, but he could not make love to a woman that his brother had asked to become his wife. I was surprised to hear this, as I still loved him dearly. He begged me to consider marrying his brother, and to think of my future life of comfort if I did so. I was terrified by this news, as I had no other friends outside of that town. If I did refuse the brother, I could never remain living in that town, and would be forced to leave immediately, but I feared agreeing to a marriage to my lover's brother. I then decided that I must marry the younger brother to save myself from poverty and suffering. After the mother agreed to the marriage, we were soon quietly married. The elder brother made certain that the younger brother was quite drunk when he came to meet me in our bed, and could remember nothing the next morning. I sincerely regretted having cheated such an honest, loving man, but he was truly in love with me, and I could not tell him that I was his brother's former lover. We were married happily for the next 5 years, and had 2 children together. At the end of the 5 years he died. He had been a very good husband to me, although he had quite a small fortune himself. I had kept the £500 that his brother had offered me to agree to marry his brother, and had a total of £1,200 when my husband died. My 2 children were taken happily by the family, and I left the family. I must admit that I was not too upset at my husband's death, as I never loved him as a wife should love her husband. His brother was always there to remind me of my first love. Before my husband died, his elder brother was married. My husband went to the wedding, but I could not bear to see my former lover married to another woman, and so I did not attend the wedding. After the death of my husband, I was still quite young and beautiful, with a small fortune of my own. Several gentlemen were interested in me, particularly one whose house I was living in after my husband's death, as his sister was a friend of mine. I enjoyed myself with my new fortune and freedom. I decided that I now must be married, and be married to a wealthy man, or not at all. This young man, whose sister was a dear friend, wished that I would become his lover, but I realized that I must never make the mistake of becoming his lover, as I had my own fortune. He soon became my husband, and spent my small fortune as he pleased, and rather quickly. 2 years later, my fortune was almost all spent, and he went to jail for some silly crime. I went to see him there, where he told me that he would soon escape from the jail, but would leave the country immediately. He told me to sell our furniture and jewelry, and to save the money myself. If I did not hear from him within a few months, I should believe him to be dead.
"I wish you well. I am sorry to cause you this pain,"
he told me during our visit. After selling our things, I discovered my fortune was much smaller than 2 years ago, as I now had only £500 left. Although I had only myself to care for, our child had died soon after its birth. My husband had many unpaid bills, and I feared my small fortune would be taken to pay them, so I immediately left, taking another name for myself, Mrs. Flanders. I soon found a room to rent far from where my husband and I had lived, and told the new people I met that my husband had recently died. These new people in my life did not know my real name or anything about my past. I soon discovered that there were few women in that area, but a great many men, several of whom were interested in me. I decided that I must be careful and guard myself. I could not begin a love affair with a man and not have the security of him taking care of me. My fortune was small, and I had to be more careful than I had been in the past. I had learned not to trust a man's promises. I stayed in this new place for a short time, but soon learned that these new men who seemed so interested in me could not be trusted. They were more evil than I was, and the little fortune I had was quickly being spent, which terrified me. I would soon have nothing and no one to help me. I had become close to a woman whose husband had died as well, but she had more of a fortune than I had. Her husband had been the captain of a ship, but had died at sea. She discovered that I had little money myself, and soon suggested that I go stay with her, explaining that I would immediately meet a wealthy ship captain who would marry me. I lived with her for half a year before she found a wealthy ship captain to marry. I, unfortunately, had not found a wealthy captain to marry me, but realized that my small fortune was quickly decreasing. It seems that ship captains were willing to marry women of fortune with no concern for love. My sister-in-law at Colchester had said that beauty, manners, good behavior, and education were not important without a fortune. I discovered that she was correct, as no man would marry me without a fortune to give them, even if the man had no money himself. The women, however, did not have the choice to refuse an offer of marriage. If a man were refused, he would go to the next house and surely be accepted. Besides this, I observed that a woman could not ask about the man's own fortune without angering him terribly. I learned this from a lady at the next house to me. A young ship captain had become quite interested in her with her £2,000 fortune. She was fond of him as well, and soon asked about his fortune. He was not pleased with such questions, and quickly told her so, explaining that he would no longer continue to visit her. She told me this story, and seemed quite worried about the situation, as she cared for him deeply, and wanted him to return. I explained that if she took my advice, he would soon return to her. She quickly agreed. I told her that she must first proclaim to the other ladies that she had discovered him to be quite an evil man, with no fortune and a terrible humor. He had announced to the other ladies in town that he had left her, but she must explain her story quickly to save herself from embarrassment. As the other women in town discovered the news, I assured them that her story was correct, which proved the information to be true. Soon enough, her father and mother refused to allow the young man to visit her. He began to take interest in other women in town, but they all strongly refused him, as they believed him to be without a fortune. The captain could attract no women, and was soon laughed at by every one in town, particularly by other ship captains. He immediately realized the terrible mistake he made, and returned to beg her to forgive him. She explained to him coldly that she did not wish to continue with him, as she now knew of his terrible character. He wrote her loving letters, attempted to visit her often, and even delivered her documents, proving that he, indeed, was a wealthy captain of his own ship. After many questions about his wealth and love for her, she finally accepted his offer of marriage, although she refused to allow him any information about her fortune. He happily obeyed, and they were soon married. I decided that I, too, must find a good husband, but must not agree to a marriage until I was certain of my husband's good character. I told my friend of my plans, the captain's new wife, who I had helped. I had only £460 left of my fortune, aside from some jewelry. My dear friend advised me that if I would trust her, she would help me find a husband very soon. I agreed, and she soon invited me to stay with her and her husband in town. She then told her husband that I had a fortune of at least £1,500, and would soon have more. He then proclaimed to the other captains in town that there was a woman of fortune living with him and his wife, whose husband had just died. I did not speak about this matter, but soon many others were told of my great wealth, and I immediately had several men interested in me. I chose a handsome young man, who declared that he was in love with me, and wanted only to marry me. I told him I was poor, but he paid no attention to those words. Perhaps he did not believe me. Although he asked me no questions about my fortune, I did ask him a bit about his. As I had heard from the other ladies that he owned land in Virginia, far away in the western side of America, I politely told him that I was not fond of traveling across the ocean to live in America. He then told me of all his business affairs, explaining that he had a yearly income of £300, but if he lived on the land, he could make nearly £1,200. I told him that I did not have a fortune suitable for a gentleman of £1,200 a year. He replied that he would not ask what my fortune was. He told me from the beginning that he would not. He promised me, however, that we would not go to Virginia if I did not desire to go. I was quite content with his words. I decided that he would make a good husband, and would not be too disappointed at my small fortune, as I had told him many times that I was no wealthy gentlewoman. We were soon married, and very happily married. I did soon find out that his income in Virginia was much less than £300 per year, but I was satisfied still. After we were married, my husband still did not ask about my fortune, so I decided to discuss it with him when we were alone. "My dear," I said, "we have been married for 2 weeks, and you still have not spoken to me about my fortune."
"You must tell me when you wish to, my dear,"
he told me.
"I am satisfied that I have the wife I love."
"That is true," I said, "but I have been worried lately, as I heard that the other captains have told you I am quite a wealthy gentlewoman."
"Well,"
he said,
"the others may have told me, perhaps, but you never told me of your fortune, so I have no reason to blame you."
I then gave him £160, telling him, "Here is something, my dear." Though the money was little, he had previously believed that I had nothing, and was delighted with the money I placed in his hand. He then told me that he had supposed that my fine clothes, gold watch, and my diamond ring had been all my fortune. For the next 2 or 3 days I said nothing, but then went to fetch another £100 from the bank to give him. A week later I brought him another £240. "And now, my dear," I said to him, "I am very sorry to tell you that I have given you my whole fortune. My husband that had died took £600 from me before he died. Otherwise, I would be a gentlewoman with £1,000. He was pleased with the £400 I gave him, as he had worried that I had nothing to give him. And so I cheated a man into marrying me, but was never caught. Although this manner of deceiving a husband into marriage is quite dangerous for a woman. My husband was a good man who loved and respected me, but he was no fool. He had expected me to have a wealthier fortune, but after discovering my true fortune, he began to speak of his land in Virginia, explaining that we could make a great deal of money if we moved there. I did not want to disappoint my new husband in his choice for a wife. Thus I told him we must move to Virginia to make a suitable income for ourselves. He was delighted with my decision. We went on board a ship with furniture and clothing for our new lives in Virginia. After a long and dangerous trip across the seas, we arrived. We lived together with his dear, sweet mother. My husband continued to be loving and respectful, and I thought we would live this way for many years, until an unfortunate incident ended all my happiness in a moment. My mother was quite a cheerful woman. She told me many stories of her past to entertain me. She also explained that most people in the town came to America as either servants with their masters, or they were prisoners in England, found guilty of crimes punishable by death, but were sent here instead. They spent many years serving their masters, but then were freed and promised land from the government. "So, child," she said, "many prisoners from Newgate become great leaders in this country." She then told me that she was of the second group, sent here from prison, after being found guilty of a small crime. She often told me about her past experience in prison, among other stories about her life. I was shocked to discover that she had spent time in Newgate, and was to be killed in prison for her crime, but was not killed as she gave birth to a child 7 months after entering the prison. After some time she was then sent to America as a servant for many years. Her master's wife died, and her master quickly married her. She had 2 children, my husband and his sister. After hearing this story, I was silent for some time before asking her name while in prison. She told me, and I immediately realized that my husband's mother was the same mother that gave birth to me in Newgate prison. I felt ill and could not speak. This discovery changed me. I was no longer living in happiness with my gentle husband and his cheerful mother, as I had for the past 3 years. I already had 2 children by my own brother, and would soon give birth to another. I worried all day and all night about this terrible situation. I could not tell my mother of this discovery. I had no way to prove my story that she was my mother as well as my husband's. My husband would never believe me either, as he thought me to be a woman of fortune and comfort my entire life. I was too afraid to tell them. I was in a new country with no friends but my mother and husband or brother. Soon after my discovery, our marriage became unbearable. I refused to sleep in my husband's bed. He became angry and unkind after my behavior had changed. I reminded him of his promise before we came to America, that if I was not satisfied with my life in Virginia, I was free to return to England. I declared that I must return to England, insisting that he treated me badly and I was too far from my friends. He attempted to persuade me to stay, reminding me of my love for my children, but I continued to demand that I leave for England immediately. My mother as well tried to persuade me to remain in Virginia. Finally, however, he became so upset with me and my continual requests to leave that he told me that I would never be allowed to leave him. He explained that if I left, my children would have no mother, and the family would suffer. After carefully considering my husband's views, I realized that he did not know the terrible secret I did, and was a hard-working, caring man, and believed this decision was the most suitable for his family. No wife that cared about her family would desire to leave, but I no longer saw him as my husband, but looked upon him as a brother, the son of my own mother. Therefore, I continued to insist that I leave for England. Finally, he called me a terrible mother, asking me how I could imagine leaving my children, never to see them again. He was correct, but I could not bear looking at them, nor could I look at him, my own brother. My husband still refused. He would neither go with me nor let me go without him. We quarreled often. I was as disrespectful and hurtful as possible to force him to let me leave. At last he proclaimed that if my terrible behavior continued, he would send me to a crazy house. This terrified me, as I knew that if I was sent to such a place, no one would believe my story of my husband being my brother as well. After he threatened to hit me, I told him that perhaps there was a secret about our marriage that he did not understand, which forced me to act as I did. I then admitted that he was not my husband by law, although neither of us should be blamed. When I told him this news, he turned pale and was soon ill. A few days later, after he recovered from his illness, he begged me to explain to him the reason we were not legally married. I explained that I would tell him nothing unless he would agree to let me return to England. He refused. He begged his mother to find out the mystery. She insisted for quite some time, although I told her the secret involved her as well. She was astonished to hear such things. Finally, I told my mother the story of my life, beginning at Newgate Prison, born into her arms. She was shocked and silent for some time before she exclaimed, "Unhappy child! What a terrible situation! Married to your own brother, having 3 children together, 2 of whom are still alive." Before she left, she promised she would not tell my brother before we spoke again.
Chapter 4.
We did not speak about the terrible news for a great while. When we did speak again about our terrible situation, my mother argued that my brother and I should continue to live as husband and wife, and I should forget this unpleasant knowledge. I refused, however, as I knew I could not bear living with my own brother as husband and wife. My mother and I knew that if others discovered this news, our family would be ruined. She promised that she would leave me part of her fortune after her death to calm me, but I disagreed with her answer to my frightening problem. I explained that if she died, no one else would believe my story, so I must return to England myself. Then I told her how he had already threatened to put me into a crazy house, which had terrified me. I told my mother that the only way for me to live was to return to England. I could not bear living with my brother as my husband. I suggested that my mother try to persuade her son to allow me to return to England, then explain the terrible secret to her son after I had left. She insisted that he would never allow me to leave, and I explained that I could not continue to live as my brother's wife. We continued to quarrel on this subject for quite some time. At last I decided that I must tell him. I could not bear living with him any longer. I told my mother of my plans. She was frightened, but I promised her that I would be gentle and careful in telling him. Finally, he promised me that he would not be angry about the news I was to tell him, and so I continued. "Well, then," I said, "it is this. As I told you before that I was not your legal wife, so I must tell you now that we are not legal husband and wife, because I am your own sister and you my own brother. We are both the children of our mother, now alive and in this house." I saw him turn pale and look terrified. I waited a few moments for him to recover, then explained my discovery in detail. My poor brother suffered greatly after finding out this terrible news. After some time, he agreed to let me return to England, offering me supplies and money to take back to England. I immediately left for my home country with a good fortune. Unfortunately, however, my supplies and a great part of my fortune were lost at sea, as there were many storms along the way. I arrived in England 8 years after I had left for America. Now, however, I was alone, with a small fortune between £200 and £300 left, and no friends to help me. My friend that had helped me find my last husband, or my brother, was dead, as was her husband as well. I went to a small town outside of London, and soon found a room in the house of a kind woman. She realized that I had quite a small fortune, and did not ask me to pay rent during the winter months, which I greatly appreciated. At that time, a handsome gentleman came to stay in the same house and showed a great interest in me, as the woman who owned the house told me. This man was quite a gentleman towards me. I soon told him that my husband had recently died, and I had just arrived from Virginia, but had lost part of my fortune during the voyage. The lady who owned the house told me that he often stayed at her home, but had a wife in a crazy house. They had not lived together as husband and wife in quite some time. He often came into my room during the night, and I into his, but did nothing more than kiss me on the cheek. He was quite a modest gentleman, which delighted me. The woman who owned the house explained that he was a gentleman of great fortune and honor. She encouraged me to continue a friendship with the man. After some time, I told him of my lost fortune. One day he invited me into his room and showed me a purse full of guineas. He asked me to take a handful of coins. I was confused at the request, but he repeated himself, begging me to trust him. Finally, I put my hand into his purse and counted 50 guineas in my hand. We lived together in this house for nearly 3 months before he began speaking of moving to London, asking me if I would go with him. I was uneasy about such a move, as I did not know his reason for inviting me. I had little fortune and no friends in the city. Therefore, I could not allow myself to be cheated. During the weeks that we were discussing his invitation to move to London, he became quite ill during a trip to another town. he sent a note to me, begging me to go visit him. I did go see him, and persuaded him to return to Bath, where I cared for him for 5 weeks, as a loving wife would. During his recovery, I moved my bed into his room, so I could care for him day and night. After he was cured, he gave me a present of 50 guineas for caring for him so tenderly. After he fully recovered, my bed was removed from his room, although he asked that I continue to sleep next to him in his bed. We slept in the same bed as brother and sister for over 2 years, as he promised me that I was not his mistress, but a dear friend.
"And now, my dear,"
he said,
"you shall see how fair I will be to you, and that I can keep my word,"
as he came into my bed. And he did not break his promise. We lived almost like husband and wife, quite content with each other until one night. We had both drunk a great deal of wine earlier in the evening, and when we went to bed, I told him that I would allow him to break his promise only on that night. He agreed, and so we were no longer dear friends, as we became lovers that night. The next morning, we were both upset with ourselves for our terrible behavior, but we still continued as lovers. Some time after we began our love affair, I discovered that I was with child, and later gave birth to a son. I was quite worried about my situation, as I had very little money. My lover, however, promised me that I should not worry. He declared that he would always care for our son and myself, but we could not marry, as his wife was still alive, although still in a crazy house. When my lover and I were quite sure that I was with child, I told the lady of the house. She was not surprised by this news, as she knew I would eventually be with child. She found me a nurse and cared for me while I waited to give birth to my child. She told my lover he should go to London during this time, so others would not discover our secret. Soon after the darling child was born, I sent him a letter to announce the birth of our child. He was delighted with the news, and suggested that I come to London as soon as I recovered. I quickly prepared to leave, along with my dear child, the baby's nurse, and a servant. My lover had found a house for us to live in. I had never before lived in such wealth, and was quite pleased with my new situation. I knew, however, that this perfect happiness could end immediately, as I understood that men often grow tired of their mistresses. I worried often about him leaving me, as I would have no fortune to live on. I lived this way, happy but unhappy, during which time I gave birth to 3 children, but only the first of them lived. One morning, after 6 years of living in this manner, I received a letter from him. He had been away on business. He explained that he was quite ill, but was being taken care of by his wife's relatives. Although, he admitted, he wished that I was there to cure him, instead of his wife's family. For the next 2 weeks I heard nothing. After this time, I became quite concerned that he had not written. Another 2 weeks passed, and I became increasingly frightened at not hearing from my dear lover. At this time I found out his location, dressed myself as a servant, and went to his home. I discovered from several of his servants that the doctor said my poor lover might soon die. This worried me considerably, as I had little money to live on with our young child, although I had saved quite a bit of the money he had given me throughout the years. The next month, however, I found out that he had recovered, and had left the city to rest in the countryside. Some time later, I discovered that he had recently returned to the city. I was content with that news and believed that he would soon come to see me. I waited a week and 2 weeks, and with much surprise, nearly 2 months, and heard nothing. Another 2 months passed. I wrote him several letters, explaining my hopeless situation, begging him to come see our son and I. Finally, he responded to the last letter I sent to him, although I only found out that he was leaving me. He told me that he had sent a letter to me some time before, desiring me to return to Bath to live, but I had not received that letter. He explained that during his illness he had realized his terrible wrong in having a mistress. As he recovered, he decided that he would end our love affair and never see me again. He felt terrible for leaving me alone with our child, but he could not continue, as his wife was still alive, and now lived with him and her family. And here is the letter I had waited so long to receive.
Madam, I am surprised that my letter, dated the 8th of last month, was not received by you. I promise you that it was delivered to your home and given to your maid. I do not need to explain my illness to you, as I am quite sure you have discovered the news about how I was rather close to death, but have recovered completely. You should not be surprised to hear that our love affair has upset me greatly, and I have thought of it quite often during my illness. I will not say more. Our mistake must end now and forgotten forever. I wish you would think of going back to Bath. With this letter, I have also given you £50 as payment for the apartment for the last few months. I hope it will not surprise you to say that I can see you no more. I will take care of the child, leave him where he is, or take him with you. I hope you have had the same thoughts about our love affair. I believe your life will improve now that we are not in such a terrible situation.
This letter hurt me with 1,000 wounds. I had known, even before our love affair began, that I would suffer in the end as I now was. He had realized his evil doings, regretted them, and was now content with himself and his life. I, however, was the evil temptation he had given up, who he would think of with hatred. I lived the next month in my sadness. I did not return to Bath. I was afraid the woman whose house I had lived at would persuade me into an evil affair again, as she had done with my lover. Besides, I did not want her to discover that he had left me. And now I was rather confused about what to do with my little boy. I would rather die than leave him, and yet I knew that we would both be in great danger if I traveled with him alone. I then decided to leave him, but then I concluded that I must be near him too. So I sent my gentleman a short letter that I had obeyed his orders, and would leave the child for him to care for, as I did not have the wealth to take care of our little boy. I asked that he give me £50 to return to my mother in Virginia, as my gentleman knew that I had come from there when I met him. I then promised that I would never contact him again if he would send the £50. I did not plan to return to Virginia, however, but I knew that his £50 would be the last I would receive. I intended to remain close to my son, to watch over him as he grew. He sent me the £50, and our affair was finished. We had begun as close friends, but our desire for each other ended our simple life together, to eventually make me suffer, losing my lover and my dear boy. I was now a single person again, as I had not heard from my husband, who had left the country for 15 years. With the £50 my gentleman had sent me, I now had a small fortune of nearly £400. I should have had £500, but I lost £100 doing business with quite an evil man, who stole my money. Now I was in quite a different situation, being single, but much older, as I was 42 years old. I looked younger than my true age, but I certainly did not look like a young woman who could easily find a husband to marry. I thought very carefully about what to do with my life, with no one in the world to care for me if I lost my fortune. I soon discovered that having no friends was the worst of problems for a woman. Men are able to conduct their own business and work for themselves, but women are not allowed that freedom. It seems that the more money a woman has, the more danger she is in of losing her fortune. I understood this problem, as I had lost £100 through being cheated. I was now alone again in the world, with no one to guide or help me. I knew what I wanted, but I knew nothing about how to obtain it. I wanted to be settled in a place with no secret worries. If I had found an honest, good husband, I would have been a true, honorable wife to him. I was only evil and dishonest when I was in need. If I was never without money, or had friends to help me, I would never have become the evil person that I have become. I would be a better wife, given the many difficulties I have had. During the times I was married, my husbands never worried about my behavior, as I was always an excellent wife. But all this was nothing. I found nothing to encourage me now. I waited. I lived carefully, spending very little money. I was terrified that I would soon be poor, with no one to help me. I had some money, but I did not know where to keep it safe. After some time, an opportunity came to me. I was living in a house with a gentlewoman from the northern countryside. She often spoke about how inexpensive it was to live in the northern countryside, and how honest the people there were. After hearing such things quite often, I began to think of moving there. I told her she almost tempted me to go and live there, for I was now a widow and had to be careful with my small fortune, and that I spent nearly £100 a year living in London, with no servant and never leaving my home. She was surprised when I told her this, as she had believed, like everyone else, that I was a woman of great fortune. She was pleased, however, to hear that I might be interested in going to her part of the country. She told me that she was leaving to visit her sister in Liverpool in 2 months, and suggested that I join her. She said her sister would be delighted to meet me, and if I was pleased with the city, she would easily find me cheap housing there with a family. I happily agreed to visit the city with her, hoping that what she told me was the truth, as I was now greatly disturbed about my living situation. I had no one to advise me in how to keep my money safe. I was quite worried that I would one day be robbed of my small fortune. I was afraid to ask someone to help me, as if my money was lost or stolen, I would have nothing. One morning, however, I went to the bank on business, where I met an honest clerk who had corrected me when I had taken out less money than I should have. He could have not told me, and kept the money for himself, but instead he very respectfully told me of my mistake and gave me the correct amount. I went to him and asked if he would be my adviser, who was a poor, friendless woman whose husband had died. He told me that if I desired his opinion on anything, he would help me, and that he would not cheat me. I thought for a moment, then agreed. He explained that he had another clerk friend who would be able to help me more than he could, but promised that his friend was as honest as he was, and I should not fear being cheated.
You will be satisfied with my friend, just as you are with me. He is thoroughly able to help you, which I am not.
It seems that he was quite busy with his bank work, and would not conduct business other than his bank work. He explained that his friend would charge me nothing for his advice, and this indeed encouraged me. That same evening I met him and his friend. As soon as I met his friend, I knew he was as honest as the other, and trusted him immediately. Afterwards, I heard from others that he was, indeed, a sincere and honorable man. After the first meeting, he told me to come the next day to discuss my situation further. The following day, I told him quite a bit more about my story, explaining that I was a widow who had returned from America with no friends or family, and that I had a little money, but I was quite afraid of losing it. Having no friend to trust with the little money I had, I would be willing to leave my money in the bank, but did not know how to reclaim it while living in the north of England, where I would soon be going. He told me that I could easily keep my money safe in the bank as an account, from which I could take money out of in the north or in London. He was quite honest and sweet with me, and I thought once or twice that he was interested in me. At last, however, I discovered he had a wife, but when he admitted that he did indeed have a wife, he looked quite disappointed and said that he had a wife and no wife. I began to think that perhaps his wife was in a crazy house, as was the wife of my former lover, but we had no more time to speak of it. He asked that I meet him at his house for our next meeting to discuss my business affairs. I agreed to go and desired to know where he lived.
If you trust yourself with me,
he said after he told me the way to his home. Yes, sir, said I. I believe I should trust you with myself, for you have a wife, and I don't want a husband. Besides, I trust you with my money, which is all I have. When I met him at his home, he suggested several times that I place my money in the bank, although he explained all the dangers of such a choice. I realized as he spoke that I had certainly found the honest man I wanted. I told him sincerely that I had never met a man or woman I could trust more than him. He smiled and told me that he was delighted to hear that I had so good an opinion of him. He promised he would not cheat me, and he would help me any way he could, but expected no salary from me. I explained that I had no family left, and that if I died, my fortune would be his, payment for being so faithful and true to me. That evening he admitted that he wished he was single, so we could marry. I smiled and told him that he was not. He told me I was wrong.
For,
said he,
as I said before, I have a wife and no wife, and it would not be evil to wish her dead.
I know nothing about that situation, sir, but it cannot be honest to wish your wife dead.
I have told you,
said he again.
she is a wife and no wife. You don't understand how terrible a wife she is."
"That's true," said I. "I believe you to be an honest man, so I trust what you tell me."
"Well,"
said he,
"she has cheated me, as she has had love affairs with other men while we were married."
"Now I better understand your anger," I told him, after a short silence. "You are too kind to her to call her your wife still."
Chapter 5.
I attempted to talk about my business affairs, but he was not listening. Instead, he continued speaking with anger about his wife, telling me that while he had been out of England on business for 2 years, his wife had had 2 children with another man. When her husband had returned, he had forgiven her, and they lived together again as husband and wife. Soon enough, however, his wife left him for another man, robbing her husband of his money before she left.
"So,"
said he,
"she is a thief and a liar, not because she needed to, but because she is truly evil."
Well, I pitied him and hoped he would soon leave his wife. But I still tried to talk to him about business, but he desired only to speak of his wife. At last he looked at me and asked,
"You, madam, came to ask advice of me, and I will help you, but I must ask you to advise me as well. Tell me, what shall I do with my evil wife?"
"It seems that she has run away from you, thus no longer your wife. What more do you desire?"
"Yes, she is gone indeed,"
said he.
"but I would like to marry again."
"Well, sir," said I, "then you must divorce her. If you can prove what she did to you, then you are free from her."
"That can be expensive,"
said he. "Well, if your wife is to blame for your failed marriage, then you must be divorced. Then you are free to find an honest woman to marry."
"I must ask you a question then,"
he said, then paused.
"I desire that you shall be the woman I marry, or I will not be divorced."
I was delighted to hear him say these words, but I knew that I must wait until after he was divorced to agree to the marriage, which would certainly persuade him to end his marriage quickly. Meanwhile, I would go to the north of London to live cheaply. The next evening I met him at his home again. He asked me to sign an agreement, promising that when he was finally divorced, I would return to London and we would be married. I told him I would not sign the contract, but that I would allow him to write to me in the north of England. Although I did not tell him, I refused to sign the agreement because my friend, who was to take me to the north of England, had promised me fortune and wealthy husbands there, which I planned to find out about. My friend and I soon left for Liverpool. We stayed together for nearly 6 weeks, often receiving visits from her brother. After this time, I was taken to a cottage outside the city to live, where her brother often came to see me. Soon enough he became my lover, telling me often of his great fortune. His sister explained that he had an income of £1,000 a year, in addition to a great amount of land in Ireland, where he usually lived. I looked like a gentlewoman of great fortune, with many fine clothes and a few servants to care for me, although I had never told my friend of my wealth. She had, however, believed my fortune not to be £500, which it was, but to be £5,000. Later she declared it to be £15,000 to the people in Liverpool. Soon enough her brother and I were married, although I continued to write to the gentleman clerk in London who was hurriedly obtaining a divorce. I felt terrible for cheating him, but my friend persuaded me to marry her brother, promising me a life of comfort and wealth. The love affair happened quickly, during which the sister immediately persuaded me to marry her brother. After we had been married about a month, he began speaking more often of moving to Ireland, where he owned quite a bit of land. We soon decided that we would go to Ireland to live. A short time before we were to leave, my husband asked me if I had to go to the Bank of England for my business affairs. I was quite confused as to his reason for asking me this question. I had never done business in the Bank of England.
"Madam,"
said he, very respectfully,
"my sister has told me that your fortune is safe in the Bank of England. But perhaps you would like to take your money with you to Ireland, where you will be living."
I was still quite confused, and told him that I had no money in the Bank of England. I decided that I must speak to his sister before I left for a strange country where I knew no one. The next morning I explained to her what her brother had asked me. She admitted that I had never told her my fortune was in the Bank of England, or that I did indeed have a great fortune. When I first met you, I explained that I wished to go to the country where I could live quite cheaply. How could you still believe me to be a woman of fortune after I admitted that? I asked her, just as my husband came into the room. I asked him to sit down with his sister and I. He looked worried. "Well, my dear," I said to him, "someone has cheated you, but it was not me, I promise you. I never told you I had a great fortune, and I should tell you now that, in fact, I am not a gentlewoman of fortune. We have both been cheated, my dear, as I never told your sister I had a fortune." He now looked scared and wild. He was silent, but after some time he stood up, red in the face, screaming at his sister, although I soon discovered that she had been his mistress for 2 years. He was to pay her £500 for persuading me to marry him. He declared that she had ruined him, exclaiming that she had told him I had £15,000. She cried. He had spent all the money he had, so he looked like a gentleman of fortune, and now had nothing left. He screamed at her more. She cried again, saying that she had been told about my fortune at the house in London, where we met. This only upset him more.
"Well, my dear,"
he said to me tenderly,
"we are both ruined, as I have no fortune. The little money I did have, this devil woman forced me to spend so I would look like a gentleman of fortune."
I was silent now, confused at what he was saying to me. But soon I began to speak. "We are married, but you have cheated me, having told me that you had a great fortune when you did not. If I had had a great fortune, I would have been cheated out of it, as you say you have nothing."
"You would indeed have been cheated, my dear,"
said he.
"but £15,000 is a great deal of money for us both to live on. Besides, I had decided to spend my life making you happy. I would have spent your fortune only to make you comfortable."
This was very honest indeed, and I really believe he spoke the truth. He was a man who could make me quite happy, I knew. However, we had no money to live on, which worried my husband and I greatly. The next day was filled with sadness, but my husband seemed a bit happier after dinner. I was still angry with that foolish woman for attempting to cheat me, but I was no longer upset with my husband. He was, indeed, a good husband and a true gentleman, although still a gentleman without a fortune. We had a great deal of conversation that night, as neither of us could sleep. He felt terrible for cheating me, and offered me the little money he had, but I could not accept it, or he would have nothing for himself. He woke up before me in the morning. After I awoke, I found a letter from him, explaining that he had left, with his servants, horses, and baggage.
My dear, I am a dog. I have hurt you. Forgive me, my dear. I ask you to pardon what I have done to you sincerely. I have felt terrible for having cheated you. I was so happy to have you as my wife, and am now broken-hearted to be forced to leave you. Forgive me, my dear. Please forgive me. I cannot care for you, as I have no fortune. Our marriage is nothing. I shall never be able to see you again. Please find happiness. I hope you will find a husband of great fortune. However, if you do not marry and I become wealthy, it shall all be yours. I have left some money for you. Again, I sincerely ask you to forgive me. Goodbye, my dear, forever. J.E.
Nothing in my life had ever upset me more than that letter did. I was angry with him for leaving me, as I only wanted to be with him. I was no longer worried about being a gentlewoman of fortune. I saw that he had left me 10 guineas, his gold watch, and a few rings. I sat down for the next few hours, looking at his letter, crying and calling his name. "Oh, Jimmy, come back, come back. I'll give you all I have." Then I would walk around the room, calling his name again, telling him to come back, and then cried again. I spent the day crying for my lost husband till about 7 o'clock, when he surprised me by returning to me. I did not know whether to be glad or angry, but when I saw him I was overjoyed, and ran to him. I told him how I spent the day, and how loudly I had called his name, telling him to return. He told me that he had heard me from a forest, about 12 miles away.
Do not think I am lying. As I heard you call me, you said, "Oh, Jemmy, oh, Jemmy, come back, come back."
I laughed at him, but he insisted that he had heard my voice. I told him he must never leave me again, but he explained that he only returned to say good-bye to me. I persuaded him to stay with me for a week more. He agreed. During the next week, I told him of a plan for us to stay together, while making a fortune for ourselves. I explained that we could leave for Virginia, where we would buy land cheaply, eventually able to make a great deal of money from the land. I then told him that I knew a great number of people that had bought land there and had become quite wealthy. At first he was rather interested in this idea, but eventually he began speaking about moving to Ireland to buy land in the same manner, telling me that he could make a great deal more money there. He promised me that he would come back for me if he was successful. I gave him an address that he could write me at, although I never told him my real name. Soon after I arrived in London and lived very quietly, remembering my wonderful time with my husband. My happiness ended when I discovered I was with child. I was quite worried as to what to do. I had no friends to ask for help, and did not know where to go to have this child. During this time, I had continued to write to my friend at the bank, or rather he had continued to write to me. as he wrote to me nearly once a week. In his latest letter, he explained that his divorce was almost complete, though he had some unexpected difficulties. I was pleased to hear that his divorce was taking longer. Though I could not marry him now, as I was with child, I decided that I would marry him if he was still planning to marry me. I believed that my husband would never contact me again. After some time, the family of the house noticed that I was with child. Shortly after, the lady of the house politely suggested that I find another place to live, as I was there alone with no husband, which did not look proper. After this, I became quite upset, as I had no place to go to have this child. I was so worried about my situation that I soon became rather ill. The lady of the house suggested that I find a nurse to help me, but I told her that I did not know any nurse in the area, so she promised me she would find an excellent nurse for me. Soon enough, the nurse came to see me. She explained her services and fees, which were rather cheap. I was delighted to hear this. She told me that I could go to live at her house, where many women went to have their children, which was a comfortable place with private rooms and servants. After speaking to her several times, I realized that most of the women who she helped were unmarried women, often mistresses. I explained to her that I did have a husband, but he was far away and unable to return. She seemed unconcerned with whether or not I had a husband. She explained that whether I was a wife or a mistress, she would care for me. Soon after, I moved into her house. On the day I arrived, she sent me a roasted chicken and a bottle of wine to welcome me. She visited me often during my stay, which eased me a great deal. After being at her home for a week, my illness was cured. I had become ill when I realized I had no place to go to have my child. Now, however, I no longer had such worries. My nurse often spoke to me about what I would do with the child after it was born. I was, indeed, quite concerned about what to do with my child, as I had little money to care for the poor baby. She told me that many women who came to live at her house to have their babies were unable to care for their children and were placed with other families who would raise the children. I was worried, however, that my child would not be properly cared for. I feared for my child. My nurse assured me, however, that she would find the best families to care for the children. She reminded me as well that many of these children would live on the streets with no one to care for them, or die if she did not find them homes. We spoke about this quite often, as I was rather anxious about what to do with my child after its birth. While I stayed in her house for nearly 4 months, I discovered that my dear nurse did not earn any money through taking care of these women, as she had 13 in the house with me and took care of nearly 32 in other homes. She earned her income from other work. She cared for each woman with great care, as if each woman was her own daughter. I was shocked to see how many women she was taking care of, all of whom had the great problem I did, that they were all without husbands and had no one to care for them. I never saw anything improper in that house. No men were allowed in the house unless they were relatives of the women living there, and were only allowed to visit the women if the dear old nurse was in the room. A short time before I was to give birth to my child, I received another letter from my banker friend. He explained that he had finally obtained a divorce and wished to marry me, if I would still agree to marry him. On the evening that his wife was informed of their divorce, she killed herself. He did not regret his decision to divorce her, but was upset that she decided to kill herself. Although he no longer loved her as a wife, he declared that he was still greatly in love with me and wanted nothing but to be with me. I, of course, had not told him that I was with child. I felt rather guilty for cheating him. If he had known I was with child, he would have been broken-hearted. I wrote to him to congratulate him on his divorce. In the letter, I did not give an answer to his offer of marriage. I explained that he should think carefully about deciding to marry again so quickly. I mentioned, however, that I planned to return to London at the end of the year, this being the month of April. In the middle of May, I had a brave boy. My nurse helped me greatly. She knew her job well and cared for each woman with extreme care. Nearly 20 days after I had my dear son, I received another letter from my friend at the bank. He begged me to agree to marry him, explaining that he had thought a great deal about the decision to marry me and desired nothing more in life than to marry me. I was quite anxious after receiving this letter, as I now had a child to care for, and could not tell him about the child. My nurse knew that something was upsetting me greatly, and often asked me to tell her. I explained that I could never tell another person my secret. After telling her this, she began asking me more frequently about my troublesome secret, reminding me that she had never told me any secrets of the other women in her house. Finally, I explained the story of how my husband and I had attempted to cheat each other, but that my husband had told me I was free to marry again. Then I told her of my friend at the bank, who had asked me to marry him, but who as well did not know I had been with child. After concluding, my dear nurse told me that my marriage was meaningless, and I was free to marry again, as my husband and I had cheated each other, and both agreed to part. Although I was now free to marry again, I still had the problem of what to do with my dear child. I loved him dearly, but knew that I could not take care of him without a husband or a great fortune. My bank friend, however, was unaware of my new child. I greatly feared that if my friend did know, he would leave me entirely and never write to me again. I was in great pain when I thought of leaving my dear child to someone else and never seeing my baby again. I was terrified when I had such thoughts. I was quite afraid that if my child was given to someone else to be cared for, he would surely die, as he would not be given the careful attention that a mother's love provides. I often spoke of my fears to my nurse, who I came to call my mother. She seemed quite worried about my problem as well, although many women had told her of such problems. Therefore, she was more reasonable about the situation, without the emotional feelings of a mother. One particular instance, during which we were speaking of my child, she mentioned that my mother had not raised me, but I had raised myself and made a small fortune. I was rather shocked when she reminded me of not having been raised by my mother. I had had a difficult life, and did not want my dear child to suffer as I had. "Never be concerned, child," said she. "I have no bad nurses around me. I employ the best nurses, who care dearly for the children." She knew that I was still upset, quite worried about the future of my child and myself. She continued to speak of the many children her nurses care for with great love and attention. "Well, mother," said I, "your nurses are very poor, and quite delighted to receive the money, and make sure the child does not die, or they will lose their income, but they have no reason to give the child a happy, loving life." "They are as careful as any mother," said she. "They must care for the child as a mother would, or the child will be taken away, and they will lose their pay." "Oh, mother," said I, "it is impossible to be satisfied with finding a nurse for my dear child. I will always worry that my dear boy will suffer." "All right, my child. I have found out a way how you shall be certain that your child is well taken care of. If you are able to spend a bit of your income each year, you shall be able to see the child once or twice a year, although he will never know who you are." I was quite pleased with her offer, and immediately agreed. So the next week, a woman was brought to my nurse's home to take the child. I gave her £10 to take the child, and promised her another £5 every year if she would bring the child to my nurse's house once or twice a year. I then began to write to my friend at the bank more kindly. Near the beginning of July, I sent him a letter explaining that I would return to London during August. He quickly responded to my letter with great words of love, insisting that he would come meet me. I did not wish for him to see where I was staying, so I requested that he meet me in a town near London. I was very glad to see him. It pleased me as well to see the expensive gentleman's carriage he arrived in, along with a servant to care for him. He decided that we should rest at an inn for the night before returning to London the next day, as he worried that I was tired after my journey. That evening after dinner, as we were walking around the inn, I thought that he might ask me to marry him, now that he was no longer married. I decided that I must accept his offer, as I had little left of my fortune and no friends to go to. Soon enough, the owner of the inn came out to meet us. He informed my banker friend that he could call a minister to marry us, if we would need one. My gentleman answered loudly enough for me to hear.
"Very well. I believe I shall need a minister."
He then came to me, speaking sincerely of his love for me. He told me that he had wished to marry me since our first meeting, and now we were able to marry.
"I came to meet you so I would be able to ask you to marry me,"
said he, before showing me his divorce papers.
"Don't be frightened, my dear,"
said he as he kissed me. That was the first time he had spoken to me with such passion. As he spoke, I began to cry, and turned my head away so he would not see my tears. I thought of how sincere and honest this dear man was, this man who I had cheated so terribly in marrying another man and giving birth to a child. I then decided that I would no longer cheat him. I would be an honest, loving wife to this dear man. The minister was called to the inn, and we were happily married, in the presence of the inn owner, his wife, and their daughter.
Chapter 6.
The next morning, I opened the window to look out at the small village when I saw 3 gentlemen ride by and go into a nearby inn. I was shocked to discover that one of the men was my last husband, with whom I had had a child. I was frightened, as I knew his clothes, his horse, and his face quite well. I immediately closed the window, but looked out again several times before the 3 men quickly departed, as I was curious to find out his reason for coming to the village. That evening, the town was alarmed to discover that a carriage coming into town was robbed of £560 shortly after the 3 men left the town. Several police officers came into the town to find out about the men. I announced, however, that I knew one of the gentlemen quite well, and knew he was no robber, but rather a wealthy gentleman from nearby. We did, indeed, leave for London the next day, When we arrived at my husband's home, I was delighted to see that my husband had quite a lovely house, filled with many wealthy treasures. How different my life would be! I would live honestly and be an excellent wife. I would have a life of pleasure. I sincerely regretted cheating him, and promised to never cheat him again. We lived together quite pleasantly for 5 years. He was a quiet, sensible, sincere man, and worked hard at his business. I decided that I must not spend great amounts of money foolishly, as I had in the past. I chose now to live quietly with my family, and paid a great deal of attention to my husband and children, and this kind of life became a pleasure to me. After 5 calm years, however, my husband lost a great deal of our fortune to a partner in his business who had cheated him. My husband was quite upset about this loss, although I explained that he would easily make the fortune again. He did not listen, however, and soon became ill and died. I was desperate, as our fortune was gone and I now had 2 children to care for. I was now 48 years old, and no longer looked like a young beauty that could easily become a mistress to be taken care of. I had no friend to comfort or advise me. I sat and cried day and night. I lived 2 years this way, crying continually over my unfortunate situation. I had sold my house and many of my things to save a bit of money, but feared that my little fortune would soon be gone, and I would be nothing but a poor old woman with no home. I thought of this quite often with terror. One afternoon, I was wandering about the town, worrying about my poor situation, when I was walking past a clothing shop. I noticed that near the door of the shop was a great deal of expensive cloth, and the shopkeeper was not nearby. I walked into the shop, carefully took the cloth from the table near the door, and walked out. I was rather upset for having become a criminal, but had no choice. If I continued to live an honest life, I would soon have no home, and would soon die with no food. I walked away quickly, terrified that I was now a thief, and no longer an honest gentleman's wife. "Lord," I said to myself as I cried, "what am I now? A thief! I shall soon be taken to Newgate and killed." I continued this way, as I greatly feared that if I did not become a thief, I would soon be poor, with no way to buy a little bread to eat. I regretted having to steal, but I had no other way to live. Some time later, I was walking through the streets of London when I saw a young child walking alone. I began walking next to the child, speaking kindly, and explaining that I would take the dear child home. While talking to the child, I took her necklace of gold beads, but the child never noticed. I then left quietly. I was quite pleased with myself for finding such a treasure. My fears of poverty surpassed my desire to be honest and sincere. This necklace was worth nearly 12 or 14 pounds. After this adventure, I attempted many more robberies and was not caught, although I worried that I would be caught and go immediately to Newgate to be killed for my dishonesty. I stole many things from people, but did not know where to trade my goods for money. Although I had several things I had obtained from robberies, I had very little money left, and had to tell my dear child's nurse that I could no longer send her the 5 pounds each year that I had promised. I went to see my old nurse, and told her of my situation. She told me not to worry about my dear child, as he was well taken care of by his nurse, who would continue to treat him well. During the visit, I explained that I had very little money left, but had several pieces of silver, cloth, and other goods to sell, but did not know where to go for a good price. I did not tell her where the goods had come from, though. She told me that she knew someone who often bought such goods, and she would help me sell my things to him. I found that my dear nurse was quite useful to me, and could possibly help me with finding a job, as I would happily find honest employment if I could find it. She, unfortunately, had no employment to offer. She invited me at last to come live at her house till I could find something to do. I gladly accepted her offer. My nurse knew of my secret robberies, as she realized that many of the goods I had were not mine. After discovering that I was not an honest gentlewoman, she encouraged me more often to go out to steal. She often did business with such people. My nurse found a woman to teach me to steal clothing from stores, steal boots, and take off gold watches from ladies' wrists. After some time, she became my partner in robberies, and we became quite rich, stealing a great deal, which pleased my nurse. My partner had been a thief for many years, and no longer felt guilty in stealing. Some time later, I, too, no longer felt guilty about being a thief. Of course, I believe that if I had found honest work, I would not have become a thief. We became rich through our dangerous work, and continued, although we had quite a fortune to live on. I decided that I would continue as a thief until I had a fortune of 400 or 500 times, after which I would retire. After many robberies with my partner, the police caught her after a particularly dangerous adventure. She was sent to Newgate and was sentenced to death, as she had committed other crimes and had gone to prison already. Before she was killed, I went to see her to comfort her while in prison. The experience of going to Newgate, my frightening birthplace, scared me a great deal, and I could not bear to visit the place any longer. Soon enough my friend was killed. I should have stopped my stealing then, but I refused, although I had a fortune of over £200. One evening I was walking through a nearby neighborhood, looking for a robbery opportunity. I soon came to a house that was on fire. I quickly walked in, as the fire was rather small. The maids were yelling and crying, running all over the house. I told one of the servants I came from a nearby house to help remove the treasures of the house to safety. The woman looked grateful for my help and gave me a great deal of silver, cloth, and other expensive treasures. I carried my prize to my nurse, who was quite pleased with my work, my treasures being worth £24. This was the greatest and the worst prize I had ever found. I had, indeed, become distrustful and insincere, but I did pity the poor gentlewoman who lost her home and possessions, and was cheated by me as well. I cried often when I thought of that poor woman, yet that robbery encouraged me to continue as a criminal, as I became rather unfeeling after becoming a thief, but was quite careful with each adventure, as I did not wish to die in Newgate like my partner. I was once walking in a crowd, looking to steal a gentlewoman's gold watch off her wrist. I could not remove the watch from her wrist, however. I became quite frightened, scared that she would discover me behind her, attempting to steal her jewelry. I cried out that someone tried to steal my watch. The crowd stopped. Everyone looked around for the thief. Then the woman yelled that someone had tried to take her watch as well. When I go out into town as a thief, I always dress quite well in my best clothing and a gold watch on my wrist, and carry at least 20 pounds with me. Soon after I exclaimed that someone had attempted to rob me, several others in the crowd cried the same words. I was now far away from the woman. A young man was soon taken, and the crowd declared that he was the thief. He was immediately taken to the police. After this incident, I was rather frightened and did not steal watches for quite some time. My nurse, however, encouraged me to continue my robbery adventures. As my dear nurse and I became closer, she explained that she had spent many years stealing, among other manners of work. She had been caught and sent to prison for some time, then to Ireland, where she continued her work. She then returned to England to work as a nurse while continuing her dishonest work. Now I had worked as a thief for nearly 5 years without being caught by the police and sent to Newgate. Many at Newgate, however, knew my name, as they had heard of my good skills in stealing and cheating others. They all expected that I would soon be caught and sent to Newgate, but I was never caught, though many times I was quite close to being caught. My greatest danger now was that I was too well known. Many were angry that I was not in Newgate, and would attempt to cheat me, so I would soon be caught and sent to prison. These people knew me as Moll Flanders, which was not my real name, although these other thieves did not know that I once used the name Mrs. Flanders. I was rather worried that I would soon be caught, as I was so well known among other thieves. I decided to stay indoors for quite some time, refusing to go out as a thief. Finally, my nurse persuaded me to dress as a man, to go out stealing with a man my nurse had found. I went with the man usually at night to rob, although he never knew I was not actually a man. One evening we were out when we saw 5 pieces of expensive silk sitting just inside the window. My partner became rather anxious to get the pieces, although I told him we should not, as it was quite a dangerous situation. Yet he went to fetch the pieces, but someone soon saw him and yelled,
"Thief!"
He began to run, as did I. I ran back to my nurse's home and up the stairs. A crowd of people soon followed, demanding that my nurse open the door, as a man had just run inside. She was quite calm and explained that there was no man in her house. The crowd became angry and again demanded to look inside. She allowed a police officer to come in to look, but he found nothing, and told the crowd to return home. My poor partner was taken to Newgate to be killed. He proclaimed that he could find his partner, Gabriel Spencer, but he never could find me. He explained what I looked like and where I stayed, but no one could find me. I had never told my partner where I actually lived, but had always gone somewhere else so he would not know my true identity. I was quite uneasy after this event and decided to move to the countryside for some time, worried that I would be found and sent to Newgate. I stayed in the countryside for 5 weeks before my nurse sent me a message that my partner had been killed in Newgate. I was delighted, although I pitied him for the terrible end to his life. Although I was terribly frightened of being caught, I still continued as a thief after my partner was killed. Some time later, I had a new partner to help in my robberies. On one occasion, I stole some expensive material from a clothing shop, but the shop owner noticed that I took the material, so I handed it to my partner quickly before we ran in opposite directions. She was caught with the material and was sent to Newgate. I was never caught. As many of my partners were often caught and sent to Newgate, I never told anyone my real name, which saved me from Newgate. I felt terribly guilty for her misfortune in going to Newgate. I often sent her money and food after she was sent to Newgate. I obtained information about her situation and paid great attention to what would happen to the poor thing. She pleaded that she had not stolen the material, but that I, Mrs. Flanders, had given it to her as we ran from the shop. The court decided not to kill her, as she was, in fact, not the original thief. She was then sent to America to work as a servant for several years. I must repeat it again that this poor woman's situation was quite troublesome to me, as I was the reason she was sent to Newgate. However, I realized that my life would be in serious danger if anyone were to find out my name to be Moll Flanders. When I discovered that she would not be killed, I was content to find out that she would be taken to America, and therefore I would no longer be worried that she might again find me. For some time I did not leave my nurse's house as a thief. After a while, however, I began to go out for simple robberies again. I sometimes dressed as a maid or would wait near the ships to see what goods were coming from abroad. On one occasion, I went near a ship that had just returned to London from abroad. I noticed that a box full of expensive clothing and materials had just come in. I then wrote a letter from Mr. John Richardson to his dear cousin, Jemmy Cole, in London, explaining that Mr. John Richardson's mother would take the materials to him. I brought this letter to the ship workers to explain that Mr. Richardson had sent me, his aunt, to collect his things that had come on the ship.
Chapter 7.
I was quite successful in my adventures as a thief. My nurse often persuaded me to continue my life as a thief, although I became rather worried at times. During one robbery I dressed in black, as a widow whose husband had recently died. I wandered around the city looking for robbery opportunities. As I walked, I heard someone screaming,
"Stop, thief! Stop, thief!"
Someone had dressed in black as a widow and robbed a nearby shop. Just then a crowd gathered around me, and one man, the shopkeeper's assistant, declared that I had been the thief. I was immediately brought to the shop, where the shopkeeper announced that I had not been the thief. Others insisted, however, that I remain at the shop until the police officer arrived. The officer soon came, but I was still not allowed to leave, as the officer declared that I would soon be in Newgate. Soon enough, however, the true thief was brought into the shop, and the shopkeeper announced that this woman, indeed, was the thief. I then demanded that we immediately go to court. The shopkeeper apologized for refusing to let me leave earlier. On our way to the court, the actual thief had run away, but we continued to court. Nearly 500 people followed us, curious to see what was happening. We soon arrived, and the judge asked that we explain what had happened. He first asked my name, so I had to tell him my name was Mary Flanders. I then explained that my husband was a sea captain who had died while traveling to Virginia, and that I was living with my nurse for a short time before leaving for America. I then told the judge the story of the shopkeeper's assistant treating me as a criminal, although the shopkeeper had declared that I was not the thief, and that they decided to keep me at the shop. After I concluded the story, the judge declared that I was free to leave. I returned home to my nurse, quickly to explain the terrible story. When I finished explaining what had happened, she began laughing. I was shocked to see her laughing, as I was greatly disturbed after what had happened. "I laugh, child," she said, "because of how lucky you are. You shall make the shopkeeper and his assistant pay £500 to you for the way they treated you." I was worried, however, that I had told the judge my name was Mary Flanders. My name was famous in Newgate, and I was quite troubled to go to court against the shopkeeper for £500. My nurse hired an excellent lawyer who explained that we would not have to return to court to demand the £500 from the shopkeeper. He soon went to speak with the shopkeeper, explaining that if he would agree to pay me £500 for troubling me, then I would not force him to return to the court. He told the frightened shopkeeper that I was a woman of fortune, with many wealthy friends who were quite upset that I was treated so horribly by the shopkeeper and his assistant. After some time, the shopkeeper offered £50, but my lawyer demanded £500. So they continued to disagree for some time. Finally, my lawyer informed me that the shopkeeper was eager to have a meeting between us. I agreed. My lawyer requested that I dress as a woman of fortune to show the shopkeeper I was indeed quite wealthy. I arrived to the meeting in new clothing, a necklace made of pearls and diamonds that my nurse had given me to use for the meeting, a good gold watch, and my maid at my side. When I came into the room, the shopkeeper looked quite surprised to see that I appeared to be quite wealthy. The shopkeeper complimented my elegant clothing. I told him I believed he would not have treated me so rudely if he had known of my wealth. He told me he was very sorry for what had happened. He explained that he was willing to pay me for my suffering, and hoped that we could agree not to return to court. I replied that I did not intend to ruin him, but my friends insisted that I must be paid for my suffering. After some discussion of payment, we agreed that he would pay me £150, my lawyer's fees, and make me a suit of black silk. I was now indeed quite a wealthy woman, as I had nearly £700, besides clothes, rings, 2 gold watches, and some silver, and all of them stolen. I could no longer resist going out as a thief. The possibilities of the adventures excited me. A short time after the misunderstanding with the shopkeeper was finished, I dressed as a beggar woman, hoping to cheat people. I walked around the city, looking in every door and window. I hated being dirty, so this adventure was quite short, as it was not suitable to me. Every one I met seemed to be afraid of me and would not walk near me. I did not find many opportunities while out dressed as a beggar woman. One night I was standing near the doorway of an inn when a man came near on horseback. He looked around for a few moments, looking for a place to keep his horse safe. He asked that I watch his horse for him while he was inside. Soon after he walked in, I took the horse away and took it to my nurse. We did not know what to do with the horse, as my nurse and I knew not where to sell the horse. After some time, we decided that we should take the horse to another inn, then send a letter to the gentleman's inn explaining that the horse had been lost but was later found. So this was a robbery and no robbery, as I neither gained nor lost anything through it. After this adventure, I decided I no longer wished to dress as a beggar woman, as I earned very little on my adventures out. I decided instead to dress as a wealthy gentlewoman, which had previously given me several opportunities as a thief. Most people believed thieves could not look wealthy. One afternoon, I was in a clothing shop at the other side of town, watching a shopkeeper take out an expensive piece of lace. A moment later, people outside started screaming that the Queen would soon walk down the street. Everyone, including the shopkeepers, turned to watch the Queen walk by. As the crowd was watching carefully, I cautiously took the lace before quietly walking out of the shop. I slowly walked to find a carriage, as I did not wish to be caught walking down the street with the lace. Just after I stepped into the carriage, I heard loud screams coming closer. I did not hear, "Stop, thief!" because nobody ran away, but I could hear the words "robbed" and "lace," and I became quite uneasy. A moment later, the carriage driver was ready and we left. I brought my new lace home to my nurse, which was worth nearly £20. The next day I dressed up again as a woman of fortune and walked near the same shop. I walked to the park where I saw a great number of wealthy women. Soon I noticed a young miss of 13 or 14 years old step out of a carriage with her sister of about 9 years old. The two girls had no maid with them, only the carriage driver. The little miss told the driver to wait while the two girls walked through the park for a short time. After the girls went into the park, I walked towards the driver, asking about the two girls, remarking that they were quite well-mannered, pretty girls. Soon enough, I walked into the park, calling the girl by her name, Lady Betty. I began asking her about her parents, telling the girl that I was a dear friend of her mother. We walked around the park together, talking about her parents and her dear little sister. Soon the king walked by, and all in the park turned to see him go by. I helped Lady Betty to stand nearby to see the king, while I took her gold watch. The crowd of people began to move along the park as the king walked by. I left the two girls, saying, "Dear Lady Betty, take care of your little sister." And so I left with the crowd. I later heard that upon returning to her carriage, she discovered that her gold watch was gone. She explained me in great detail, and the driver knew I had been the woman, and he searched around the park for a great deal of time. I was quite fortunate in my work as a thief. My nurse and I became quite wealthy through our adventures. In the past, I had thought of retiring from such work, but my nurse insisted that we continue. Now, my nurse attempted to persuade me to end my work as a thief, but I was more courageous than before in my adventures. With my success, I became the most famous thief in London. It was the day after Christmas that I went out to a silver shop. I looked around the shop and saw that no one was in the shop. I was about to steal a few pieces of silver when I saw a man from the other side of the street come running into the shop. He then grabbed my hand and called for the owners of the shop to come. I had not touched anything in the shop, and when I saw him running over, I called for the shop owners to come. I had always had the most courage when I was in the most danger. So when he stopped me, I said that I came from the countryside to buy some silver spoons. The man laughed when I spoke, declaring that I was lying. A crowd of people now surrounded the shop, curious to find out what had happened. This man insisted that I came to steal, but he had to prove it. I demanded that we go immediately to court. The owners of the shop were rather polite, but were confused on what to do. As we were discussing what to do, the town judge came into the shop, offering to hear the story and offer advice. The shop owner explained what had happened quite honestly. Then the man from across the street told his story with foolish anger. I then explained that I had come from the countryside to buy 6 silver spoons. Luckily, I had a silver spoon in my pocket, which I showed them, telling them that I wished for the owner of the shop to make 6 others in the same manner. The judge asked the neighbor if I had, indeed, called for the shop owner. The neighbor admitted that I had, but insisted that I had because I saw the neighbor running towards the shop.
You told me earlier that this woman could not see you, as she was not facing the street. Now you say that she did see you coming.
The judge told the neighbor. Now, it was true that I was facing the inside of the shop rather than the street. However, my business as a thief required that I watch every direction, so I really did see the man come running towards the shop, though he did not notice. After hearing each story, the judge decided that I was not guilty, as I had not yet attempted to steal anything in the shop, which the shop owner and his wife agreed with. As I was leaving, however, the judge reminded me that I had come to buy 6 silver spoons, and remarked that he hoped that I would still buy them. "I'll buy the spoons still if he can match this spoon," I responded, as I showed him my silver spoon. He found the spoons and told me they were 35 shillings. So I took out my purse to pay him, in which I had nearly 20 guineas. I never went out as a thief without taking at least 20 guineas with me. I discovered that carrying such an amount of money was useful if I had trouble. When the judge saw my money, he said,
"Well, madam, now I believe you did not come here to steal. I insisted that you buy the spoons because if you did not have the money to pay for them, I would have suspected that you did not come into the shop to buy, as most thieves do not carry much money with them."
So I left the situation quite well after coming so close to being caught, and became more confident as a thief. Only 3 days after that affair, having become more courageous, I walked into a house where I saw the doors open. I took 2 pieces of silk, then went to the door to leave before 2 maids grabbed me. One of them pulled me back into the room while the other shut the door. They screamed and tore my clothes as if they were about to murder me. Then the owner of the house came running in. I told the owner that I came in because I saw the door open and was tempted by the elegant furniture inside. I was poor and had no money for food. I begged him with tears to have pity on me. His wife felt pity for me and almost persuaded her husband to let me go, but the 2 angry maids had already left the house to get a police officer. The officer soon arrived. Seeing him scared me greatly, and I began to cry again. The people there thought I would have died. The wife argued to let me leave, and the officer almost permitted me to go, as I had not been allowed to take anything. One of the maids, however, reminded the officer that I would have left the house if she had not caught me. So the officer took me to Newgate, that terrible place. I feel ill at hearing the name, the place where so many of my partners had been taken to die, the place where my mother suffered, where I was born, and from where I expected to die an infamous death, which I had successfully avoided for so long. It is impossible to describe how terrified I was at being in Newgate for the first time since my birth, after seeing so many I knew return there. I now blamed myself for returning to Newgate. I had no need for earning money, and knew there were many risks in my dangerous work. I now regretted all the evil work I had done. I regretted the work not because I hurt others in my evil doings, but that I was punished for committing the crimes. I slept little the first few nights in that miserable prison. The first night there, I sent a message to my nurse that I was caught and sent to Newgate. She spent the night out of Newgate almost as ill as I was inside the prison. The next morning she came to see me to cheer me up, but there was no way to improve my feelings of regret and hopelessness. She immediately began to prevent my being killed in prison. First, she went to the two maids and offered them nearly £100 to leave the city, so they would not go to court to explain what I had done. The maids refused, although her yearly income was only £300. My nurse told me that the maids would have refused if she had offered them £500. Then she spoke with the owners of the home. The wife had pitied me greatly, and her husband had as well. But her husband had since decided to go to court. At first, while in prison, I was horrified at being in Newgate, the place of so much misery and death. I thought of death during the day and night, thinking of all the evil things I had done in the past. The prison minister came to speak to me at times. He told me that if I did not admit all of my past evil behavior, then God would never forgive me. He would come to see me in the morning, declaring that I must admit my wrongdoing and ask God to forgive me, but then I would see the poor man asleep in the afternoon, after drinking a bottle of wine. I began to fear seeing that man, and wished not to see him any longer. I was sorry that I was in Newgate, but I still did not regret my evil life before prison. I first became stupid and senseless, and then became a thoughtless animal, and at last I became crazy, just as all the rest were. I became pleased and easy with the place, as if, indeed, I had been born there and lived there all my life. I was healthy with a great fortune, but was in a place I believed to be the most horrible in the world. I felt guilty, as I know I had committed terrible crimes, but I was terrified that I had been caught, not that I had committed any crimes. Now, however, I felt nothing. I had committed a crime, and would soon die because of it. I was famous as a criminal, and there was no way to escape. I had no hope to save myself. I knew that I would most certainly die soon. Therefore, I no longer had any sadness or fear. The past 40 years of my life were evil, filled with lying, cheating, and stealing. I no longer cared that I was to die soon. I could think of nothing. All my terrifying thoughts were past. The horrors of Newgate became familiar. All my life I had had excellent manners and behavior, but in Newgate I became as evil as the rest. I was no longer the same woman I had been before entering that prison of terror. During this time, however, I had a sudden surprise, which reminded me of my life before coming to Newgate. I was told one night that 3 men were brought to the prison who had robbed several carriages in the countryside. We prisoners were rather curious to see these brave men, who had been so successful for quite some time as robbers. The next morning the men were taken through the prison. I was shocked to see that one of the 3 was my husband, who had attempted to cheat me by telling me he had a fortune in Ireland, and the same husband who I had seen just after I married my last husband in the countryside. I was shocked to see him, although he did not recognize me, which eased me greatly. I returned to my room and cried for quite some time. "Evil woman that I am," said I, "how many poor people have to suffer because of my evil doings." This gentleman had returned to robberies after discovering that I, indeed, had no fortune. I had never admitted that I had a great fortune, but I had certainly encouraged him to believe so. I was told that he was the leader of the thieves, and had robbed many people in the countryside. He would soon die for his crimes. I felt great pity for this man that I had loved so dearly. My own death, which would come soon, was no bother to me. I was worried only about my dear husband, who had suffered greatly because of me. I then remembered the horrors of the prison, and again became quite terrified of my coming death. My dear nurse came to see me often. She acted like a true mother to me. She pitied me. She cried with me and for me, but she could not help me. I could hear other prisoners talking, who all agreed that I should die for my terrible crimes. Soon enough, another prisoner informed me that I would go to court the next Friday, only 2 days away.
"Well, Mrs. Flanders, I'll advise you that you should prepare for death,"
the prisoner told me. I became weak upon hearing the news, and could not speak.
Chapter 8.
My nurse then sent a minister to see me. Recently she had regretted all the evil crimes she had committed, and begged that I regret having committed such terrible things as well. She had not been a thief for many years, but had persuaded me to continue my work. She cried for many days, insisting that she had been the reason I was in prison. "No, mother, no," said I. "You were not to blame. I continued my life as a thief, not you. Only I have ruined myself." 2 days later, on a Friday, I was sent to court. The 2 evil maids told the judge that I had attempted to steal 2 pieces of silk, value £46. I insisted, however, that I only wanted to buy the silks. But one of the maids exclaimed that I had walked out the door of the house before she caught me. At the end, the judge gave me time to tell my story. I spoke with great emotion and cried. Many in the court cried as well, after hearing me speak. Soon after, the judge sadly declared that I would soon die for my crime, as I was quite famous for other crimes I had committed as well. After hearing this, I could no longer speak. It was now that, for the first time, I felt guilty for the evil crimes I had committed. I thought about the terrible things I had done in my life, and finally felt regret. My dear nurse's minister came to see me, and to speak of my recent feelings of regret, fear, and sadness. He explained that he was not a minister for the prison, whose only purpose was to find out the names of other criminals. He had come to see me, to comfort me before my death. He was honest and friendly with me, and I began to trust him, as I had never trusted another person before. I told him all the secrets of my past. He visited me again the next morning. He comforted me, and I desired to be forgiven by God. I no longer feared death. During the next 12 days, he came to visit me frequently, and we would discuss my past life and God's forgiveness. Soon after, however, I received news that I would die very shortly. I was terrified and again felt hopeless. The day before I was to die, the minister did not come to see me until the evening, which greatly shocked me. Although he told me that he had been speaking to the court judge, begging to have my sentence of death delayed, I was overjoyed to hear that I would not die the following day. 2 weeks later, the judge decided that since I was guilty of only one crime, I would not yet be punished by death. I waited the next 15 weeks in that terrible prison, waiting for news of my future life or death. I was then told that instead of being killed in Newgate, I would be sent as a servant to work in America. My dear minister, however, worried that I would again become a thief, as I would be traveling with others from Newgate, who were as evil as I had been before being caught. I knew that before my departure, I had to speak to my husband, who had been in Newgate for quite some time, although he and his 2 comrades had not yet gone to court. There were several people who had planned to swear in court that the 3 gentlemen had robbed them, but these people had recently disappeared. Many believed they were given money not to speak, as the 3 robbers had a great fortune together. I went to see my husband, although he did not recognize me, as I hid my face from his view. At last, however, he asked me if I knew him. I then turned to him and asked how he could not know me. He then saw my face and immediately knew I was his dear wife. We spoke for quite some time about our lives after we had parted. He explained that he had returned to life as a robber after he sadly discovered that I had no fortune. I explained that I had gone into a house to buy some furniture, but the maids had insisted that I was a thief. I, as well, had the problem of being called Moll Flanders, a famous criminal, although my husband did not know me by this name. I told him that I would soon be taken to America to be punished as a servant in Virginia, and that he should request to go as well. He had not yet gone to court, and might be allowed to leave for America. He insisted, however, that a gentleman could not do such work, and he would rather die in Newgate. I patiently explained, however, that there were many ways to quickly return to England, or to become a wealthy gentleman in America. I begged him to go with me, explaining that if only he had money as he did, we would surely have no troubles. He refused, but I spoke with him for quite some time, and finally he told me that he would trust me. I told him he would be fully satisfied with his choice of going to America. Soon enough we were taken on the ship to leave for America. For the first night we were locked in the lowest deck, guarded heavily by prison officers. I feared that we would not be able to go above deck before our departure. The next morning, however, before we left on our journey, we were allowed to go above deck. I asked a sailor on board if he could deliver a letter to my nurse, requesting some goods to take on the trip. I gave him a shilling to deliver the letter, and he immediately noticed that I had a great deal of money in my purse. After seeing that I was quite a wealthy prisoner, he was rather helpful before the departure. I sent my nurse a letter explaining that my husband and I planned to go to America as servants. Although we were both now wealthy and could easily buy our freedom, then we would buy land to farm to gain a great income from the land. I decided I would not find my mother and brother, who was once my husband, as I did not wish for them to know I was a prisoner. I also requested that she send me certain goods that I could sell upon arriving in America. The following day the helpful sailor returned with a letter from my nurse, who was delighted for my journey, as I would not be killed in prison. My husband had not yet come on board the ship, but my nurse assured me that he would soon arrive. Some time after, I saw him board the ship, which greatly eased my worries. My dear nurse promised me that my husband would very soon join me on the ship, and went to Newgate often to request that he immediately be sent to the ship. When my husband finally did arrive, I was delighted to see him, although he looked rather upset that he was to arrive in America as a dangerous criminal. He was sentenced to work as a servant for 5 years upon our arrival in America, as I was as well. Although my poor husband was quite angry at being treated as a prisoner rather than a gentleman, I explained that we would soon have no worries, and would once again be considered a wealthy couple of fortune. He became quite tender with me, and became quite cheerful at no longer being in Newgate. He once took me in his arms while telling me,
"My dear, you have saved my life twice. I will always take your advice."
Our first business was to compare our wealth. He was very honest with me, and told me he was quite wealthy before entering the prison, but had spent a great deal while in Newgate to continue living as a gentleman, which was quite expensive while in prison. He only had £108 left. Before entering Newgate, I had between £700 and £800 in the bank, but had spent a great deal on court fees and payments to live comfortably in a miserable prison. I had nearly £246 left to take to America, although I left £300 with my dear nurse. I had, as well, a number of gold rings and watches, all of which were stolen. Together, my husband and I had £354 to carry to Virginia. With this fortune, I left with my husband for a new life in America, at the age of 61. I left as a poor criminal who had just escaped being killed in Newgate. The clothes I wore were poor, and no one on the ship knew that I had a great amount of wealth with me. However, I had many good clothes and other goods on board, although I had shipped them using my real name rather than my criminal name of Moll Flanders, which I would collect after we reached Virginia. Soon before the ship was to depart from England, I went to speak to the sailor who had helped deliver the letter to my nurse. I told him that my husband and I were not poor criminals, but were rather unlucky in our misfortune at Newgate, and desired to know whether the captain could move us to a more comfortable place on the ship during the journey to America. I then placed a guinea in his hand. He took the guinea, as I could see, with great satisfaction, and assured me that he would help me. The next morning I was taking a walk around the ship when the friendly sailor came to speak to me. He told me that the captain was very curious to meet me, so I went to see him and was warmly greeted. The captain explained that my husband and I should not worry about having a comfortable voyage to America, as he assured me that we would be provided for. He insisted that we stay in a cabin near his, which was quite elegant. He, as well, invited my husband and I to have our meals with him. So I paid 15 guineas for my husband and I to live comfortably on our voyage. I was delighted to hear that we were allowed to stay in a private cabin near the captain, as I could now carry a great deal of goods to America without fearing that they would be stolen. I then sent a letter to my nurse, asking for liquor, sugar, lemons, etc., to treat the captain to excellent eating and drinking. I also requested many tools and materials for farming, as my husband and I planned to buy land to farm. A short time later, my nurse arrived on board to see me before my departure. She was delighted to see my good fortune in riding to America, not as a terrible criminal, but as a respectable gentlewoman. During her visit on board the ship, she mentioned to the captain that my husband and I were quite anxious about arriving in Virginia as servants, not the gentleman and lady we indeed were. The captain told my nurse not to worry, as we could easily find someone to buy us as servants, as we were sent from Newgate to be bought as servants for our prison punishment. Then our owner would declare us to be free, after which we would buy land to farm. The captain promised my nurse he would help us upon our arrival. My nurse and I were then satisfied that I was leaving for America, as I would be well cared for by the captain, and could begin a new life in Virginia as a gentlewoman. During the trip we often dined with the captain, while drinking bottles of good beer and wine. Nearly 42 days after leaving England, we arrived in Virginia, after quite a pleasant trip with the cheerful captain of the ship. When we came near to the shore, the captain called me to speak about how to obtain my freedom upon arriving in America. He explained that he knew someone who would buy me as a servant, but would then allow me to go free. We soon arrived in Virginia, after which the ship captain took us to meet the Virginian planter who bought us as servants. We then went to dine and drink wine. The planter then gave us a certificate declaring that we had served him faithfully and were now free to leave. For this the captain demanded that I buy 6,000 pounds of tobacco from the planter, which the captain said he would sell. We then gave the honest captain a present of 20 guineas, which he was quite satisfied with. Soon after I obtained news that my mother had died several years ago, but my brother, who I once called my husband, was still alive, living with one of our children. I was a little surprised to hear that my brother was indeed still alive. I then discovered that my brother could no longer see and could hear very poorly. I decided then that I would like to see him, although I would not announce who I was. I requested a neighbor woman to take me there, explaining that I wished to meet the other neighbors of the area. I went to see him, but when I saw my own son at the door, I was shocked to discover how my emotions changed upon seeing him. I wished to hold him and cry. I did not know what to do, and when I left, I could not speak or think of anything but my dear son, who did not know he had just spoken to his mother. The woman who led me to see my brother and child noticed that I had become quite upset upon seeing my son, although she thought I had become ill and needed to return home to rest. I quietly agreed. As we were going back, we spoke of my brother and son. The woman began telling me the story of the two men. "There is a very strange story about that family," she told me. "The old man had returned to England and fell in love with a young lady there, one of the finest women that ever was seen here. He married her and brought her here to his mother, who was alive then. He lived here several years with her," continued she, "and had several children by her. After some time, the gentleman's mother began speaking of her past in England, and the daughter-in-law became quite surprised and uneasy. In the end, it seemed that the old gentlewoman was her own mother, and so her husband was her own brother. This news horrified the family, and almost ruined them all. The young woman would not live with him, and at last went away to England and has never returned." I, of course, was quite disturbed at hearing this story. I asked her 1,000 questions about the story, and discovered that my mother had, indeed, left me a small fortune and some land, as she had promised me before I returned to England. I was delighted to hear the news, and began to plan how to obtain the fortune and the land, which was currently held by my own son. I then decided that my husband and I should move to Carolina to buy land. As I did not yet wish to have my son and brother know I had returned, I had not told my husband of my marriage to my brother, and did not desire that he discover the secret. He noticed that I was becoming increasingly anxious and worried before we left for another part of Virginia. He often asked to know what was upsetting me, but I knew I could not yet tell him the truth. I decided that my husband and I would go settle in Carolina. Then I would return to introduce myself to my son and collect the fortune that my mother had left me. I told my husband that we could not settle in Virginia, as I had many relatives living there, and I did not wish for them to know the reason for my return. I explained that we must settle elsewhere first, then return to see my relatives. Soon after we were settled in a new area, I persuaded my husband to allow me to return to Virginia to find out more about my friends. He now happily agreed, as he became familiar with the area and began to do business. He was now fully satisfied at agreeing to go to America, instead of dying in Newgate as a terrible criminal. After my husband and I had bought a great deal of land and settled, I returned to Virginia to see my brother, who was once my husband. I was now determined to return to see my brother immediately, to explain who I was. However, after arriving in the town, I decided instead to write a letter to him first, to tell him I had arrived, and that I had not come to trouble him, but had come as a loving sister. I said some very tender, kind things in the letter about our son, asking that I would be able to visit my dear child, who I had not seen since he was a small child. I knew that since my brother could no longer see, the letter would immediately be given to his son, who would read the letter first. Soon after the letter was sent to the house, my dear son demanded to know where he could find the woman who wrote the letter. He was told and immediately came to see me. "There she is, sir," my son was told, as he entered the inn. He then came directly to me, kissed me, took me in his arms, and began to cry like a young child. I was overjoyed at seeing my dear child again, who now recognized his own mother. After a short time, we both sat down to talk. He told me that he had not shown my letter to his father or told him anything about my return, as my brother was quite ill and could no longer see, and worried quite often. I realized that my son had decided wisely not to tell his father that I had returned. My son explained that he knew I could not bear to see my brother, after discovering that the man who had once been my husband was actually my brother. My son then explained that my mother had left me a small fortune, which he had kept for me, hoping that I would one day return. A few days later, my son asked me about where I was living, and soon explained that he owned a great deal of land nearby. He insisted that if I were to move to this land, I could earn an income of nearly £150 a year. He told me as well that he made quite a fortune on his own land from selling tobacco. He then explained that he would happily send me about £100 a year, part of the income he earned from his land. This news was all strangely wonderful to me, although I still worried about my husband, who I loved dearly and would not leave again. During my stay, I often dined with my son and my brother. Although my son did not tell his father my true identity, I stayed here about 5 weeks before returning to my husband. We decided to stay on our land, where we made a great income from the land, and after a short time had several servants working on a great deal of land. During the 2nd year there, my dear nurse came to live, taking along the rest of my fortune I had left with her, which greatly surprised my husband when it arrived.
I see now that I was not cheated when I married you, a woman of fortune. I think I have married a fortune, and a very good fortune too,"
said he. We were now quite comfortable and wealthy, and increased our fortune every year. After 8 years, we earned nearly £300 a year. Nearly a year after I had returned from the first visit to my son, I was surprised to hear that my brother, or old husband, had died. This news was quite agreeable to me, because I could now explain the story to my husband and my son. My son continued to pay me £100 a year from the income on his land, and sent me home each year with a great number of presents. Some time after my brother had died, I told my son that I had gotten married and invited him over to see us. After my brother had died, I told my husband the story of that marriage. Although I did not tell my son that I had been married to my husband for several years, but rather that he had owned land nearby, and we had married soon after we met. My husband was quite understanding after I explained the story of my old husband also being my brother. We lived together with the greatest kindness and comfort. We have now grown old. I have come back to England, being almost 70 years old. My husband, 68. We are both in good heart and health. We have decided to live in England for the rest of our lives, to live honestly, after so many years of evil lies and cheating.
Written in the year 1683.